Welcome to the BMI Podcast, guys.
Welcome.
Today, me and Mikey, we're going to be talking about creatine, and we're just going to run over a few questions about creatine and maybe give a layman's terms sort of description, because we see a lot of stuff out there, right? We talked about it earlier on. What was the term that you were talking about?
Adenosine triphosphate.
Yeah. So like when you bring that up, like me, the dummy, goes like, what do you mean? Like, sounds fancy, but it's sort of, it's hard for other people to sort of grasp the notion, or what exactly is he talking about,
Yeah, I mean, every time I try to talk about creatine, there's almost a hesitancy because it quite easily can get lost in translation, because I know why it's good, but trying to translate that into why other people should think that it's good without kind of completely numbing it down to a point where it misses the point, or it gets broified, and you just end up with a whole lot of bro science around there. That it's kind of like, it's a challenge, but we'll give it a crack.
Yeah. Well, one of the first questions I got here is creatine safe? There's a lot of research around it.
Very safe. So creatine, I think next to caffeine. Caffeine is the most researched supplement in the world, creatine being the second most researched supplement in the world. Relatively safe. So I think early on there was a bit around kidneys, which has been kind of later to be disproven.
Is that more related to protein? Was it sort of?
No, so creatine, what typically happens is when you take creatine, it increases creatine kinase, which is kind of like an inflammatory marker of how well the kidneys and liver is kind of like working.
Okay.
And so normally when you see people in kind of like kidney failure, or they'll have high creatine kinase. Yeah. And so there's kind of like a whole bit of, have you heard of correlation versus causation? Yeah. It's a whole lot of that going on where, you see people with kidney failure have high creatine kinase. Well, then you also see creatine kinase go up as an inflammatory marker when people are taking creatine. And so there's the association or the correlation of, well, if you take creatine, that's going to damage your kidneys, whereas it's not quite the case. A lot of the inflammatory kind of response that would end up going on, I think, is really more local to just the water retention effect that it has. Because, like, have you heard of creatine kind of putting on weight?
Water retention or something like that. Yeah. That's one of my questions I got here for later on. So
creatine essentially will draw in water weight, which is inherently going to be pro-inflammatory, right? Like inflammation is literally water in an area. And so creatine actually does draw in water to an area.
So I didn't even actually know that. Like, that was the actual,
Yeah.
I know of an inflamed area, we were literally talking about my inflamed knee just before. So, so is it introducing water into an area? Is that
at the simplest level? Yep. So that could be blood, that could be edema, which is actually just kind of like water itself. So you've seen like people with swollen ankles.
Yep.
That's edema. So it's just pooled water, and it just doesn't really go anywhere. Now that's a good thing, and that's a good thing purely because it's perceived as a threat. So when there's excess amount of kind of like fluid in an area, that's threatening to the body, and so it's trying to send nutrient-dense blood to that area to actually clear that threat.
So it's in recovery mode, pretty much.
Recovery mode, yeah, exactly. And so that inflammation is actually kind of like the first stage of recovery. It's just inhibiting. And when you've got inflammation, as we've kind of talked about with your knee, that just inhibits your ability to then still do the same work that you were doing before. But that's the body going through the recovery process, and that's one of the first stages of the recovery process.
Gotcha.
So creatine actually draws water in into where it goes, and so that obviously increases inflammation as well.
Oh, cool. So like all in all, like it's one of the safest
supplements
that you can take. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. So like, how does it work? So give us sort of a layman's term sort of breakdown on that, or even go into depth if you want to, but like how does the creatine work, and what does it work on?
So the easiest way to think about creatine is it's another energy system. And it's not quite the energy system itself, but it's the most simplest way to think about it. And I know we talked about when we were talking about running the difference between carbohydrates and fats being a fuel source.
Yep.
Well, creatine's a third. So there's another source of energy. So when carbohydrate and fat get broken down, they'll get broken down into ATP, and that was the big word, the adenosine triphosphate.
Yeah.
So once you break down carbohydrate and fat, you're not getting the fuel from just the carbohydrate. Like, it's not the carbohydrate that's giving you the energy. It's being broken down into ATP, which is what your body actually uses for energy.
Yeah, and that's the term I actually hear quite a lot in the
ATP.
reels. Yeah, ATP. Yep. That's like it sort of was like, oh, yeah, that sparked a sign, because that's what I've been hearing a lot of, you know.
Yep.
So ATP.
And ATP is its kind of own independent. So you've got 3 kind of energy systems that you'll go through. Each of those energy systems is always being used. So even us just sitting here right now, we're using a combination of ATP, carbohydrate, and fat.
Yep.
When you're running, doing the same thing. When you're lifting weights, you're doing the same thing. The intensity will govern what percentage of that energy is being used from what area.
Yep.
So typically, the higher the intensity, the closer to the original source that you'll be looking at, which is ATP. So if we just assume that kind of creatine is another synonym for ATP in this stage, the faster you do an activity, or an activity that requires the fastest and most explosive kind of work, so if you think jumping or throwing a punch, anything essentially up to about 10 seconds is going to be used. The predominant energy source will be creatine. From there, from about 10 seconds through till, let's say, 2 minutes, the predominant energy source is going to be carbohydrate.
Yeah.
And then from there on, basically 2 minutes on, the predominant energy source will be fat. And so at one end of the spectrum, fat being quite slow, that's because oxygen can actually create ATP, or oxygen is required to break down fat, which allows to be produced, or allows your body to produce ATP from that fat, or creatine from that fat. Now, once it's kind of produced that, again, the faster you go down, the less oxygen that you can actually use. And so now you're starting to use, carbohydrate but for the most part, can be burnt also without oxygen. Yeah. So again, you think about a little bit harder, because it's not that you're never breathing.
Yeah.
But you could potentially perform the exercise. If you think about like doing a sprint or a 1 rep max bench press.
Yeah.
You could technically do that without breathing. Like, you just take oxygen in and essentially you could still do the movement.
Yeah.
But oxygen isn't required to break down the energy source. And that's why we breathe it in. We breathe it in to help us actually mobilize that energy source.
Yeah.
And so that's why when you're kind of in an aerobic, which is an oxygen zone, you're burning fat. And that's why they label it the fat burning zone.
Yeah, yeah.
So creatine essentially kind of works as an early stage energy system. And so if you think kind of 0 to 10 seconds, that's where creatine is mostly being used.
Okay.
And so your muscle has these kind of floating, it's called ADP.
Yep.
Which is adenosine diphosphate. So science is pretty easy.
Yep.
Let's just break down the words. It's literally adenosine and then triphosphate, 3 triphosphates. So it's 1 adenosine and 3 phosphates. That's ATP.
Yep.
For those listening, I'm kind of like doing a little additive with my hands. So I've got 1 finger and then adding another 3 fingers to it to create ATP.
Yep.
ADP is the adenosine diphosphate 2. So it's 2 phosphates and the adenosine. So it's missing that third. Yeah?
Yep.
In the body, there's a lot of ADP floating around, and there's individual Ps or phosphates floating around. It will then get pulled, and so once you pull a third phosphate into that ADP, you now create ATP. That's the combustion energy that actually we use to produce.
Sort of like an atom sort of thing.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And creatine saturates the cell with more of those floating Ps. So the amount of adenosine diphosphate that you've got in your system, there's more of the individual phosphates that you can just add together to create energy. So it's saturating your body, very much like saturating your body with carbohydrates. So if you're going for like a long run and you're carb loading, you're putting as much carbohydrate into the body as you can so you can use that the next day. Similar kind of thing with creatine.
Yep.
Creatine, you'll saturate the system so that you've got that rapid energy source that you can use. Now, it's used kind of in that early phase, and that's for the most part where it's actually kind of most effective.
Yep.
So anything that's explosive, like I said, kind of 0 to 10 seconds, is for the most part where they've seen it's kind of been the most effective in terms of being used. And so if you think about sprints, strength training and things like that, power training, anything that requires a lot of explosive or fast movement, that's the energy source that you'll be using is that ATP.
Yeah.
And so phosphate and creatine in that sense will be the most useful.
Just for like those ones for max output type of exercises.
Yeah, pretty much. Because that's the predominant energy source that's being used. Now, what happens when you saturate the cell is that you've obviously got more of those phosphates. And so the idea is that now you can do more work at the same intensity.
Gotcha.
Right? So if you're doing a strength set, well, maybe by set 3, you're starting to fatigue. But with creatine in your system, you've got those free-floating phosphates.
Yep.
Now you'll be able to do 5 sets. So instead of kind of fatiguing at a certain point where you would otherwise be able, you'd then start to use carbohydrate.
Just a bit more output.
You get a little bit more output.
Yeah.
100%. And so a lot of the early stuff is based on that. And so the biggest kind of benefit really in the early stages was actually around repeated sprints. So a lot of like repeated cycling efforts and things are being used.
Yep.
But anything essentially that's 0 to 10 seconds is where it'll be used the most. There's other mechanisms where it can work, and it kind of helps to build muscle, and it can also help the brain. But I don't know if you want to get into that now or if you had other questions.
Yeah, well, my next question was like, does it lead to like water retention? You know, we talked about it briefly just before, just with introducing water to an area, but like, dive into that one a bit more.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the pathways that it helps or tends to help muscle building. So when we think about muscle building, there's 2 ways in which that it can work. Obviously, from a strength perspective, it's giving your body more rapid energy so it can do those kind of 1 or 2 reps for longer or more sets of that. Obviously, that's going to help when you go into just doing a traditional set. So even though a traditional set might take 30 seconds or 20 seconds, so if you do a set of 10 to 12, it might take 20 or 30 seconds as opposed to 10. You should still be able to get more in that kind of first 10 than what you otherwise would have because you've still saturated. So it still allows you to do more work and or recover faster because you've got those floating phosphates.
Gotcha.
The second byproduct is actually being able to saturate the muscle. And so this is hard to kind of actually test because it could be anything, which leads to kind of muscle growth. But one of the hypothesized areas in terms of how creatine, and in particular, you know, like when you go and get the pump. So there's 2 forms of hypertrophy or building muscle. One's, call it sarcoplasmic, which is basically just the fluid that's inside the muscle. So muscle is, or the body is like 60-70% water, right? That water for the most part is stored within muscle. So all of that stuff. And then you've got contractile, which is just, if you think of a steak, like the actual meat that you eat is the contractile. So that's the muscle itself versus all the water and stuff that comes out of that steak.
Yeah, that's why you lose so much weight when you kill a beast or something like that. Yeah,
that's exactly it. So like that happens inside our body too. So we can either increase the amount of like actual steak that's there, the muscle fibers, or we can increase the fluid that's in that muscle. And so
blow it up.
Yeah, and I mean, easy one that springs to mind for me is chicken breast. Like if you go to get a chicken breast and you see those like juicy looking chicken breasts, like for the most part they've probably just been hydrated, so they've just been flooded with water, versus like a smaller one, less fluid in it, right? And so that's again very similar to the muscle. Now it will look bigger. So when you saturate it, it will look bigger. When you saturate it with water, it will look bigger. So creatine being an osmolyte, osmosis draws water in. Creatine being a compound that does that, as soon as you take it, you'll actually draw the water, or you draw fluid with it into the muscle cell because creatine's stored in muscle. So as it's drawing water in, can go back to that inflammation process, it's starting to put more water into that muscle. Now, it's not as much as when you go and get a pump.
Yeah.
So if you go and get a pump and you get that pump sensation, that's inflammation, right? Similar with creatine. Creatine will draw fluid in. It creates that kind of almost mini pump, which basically is perceived as a mini threat. And so that mini threat, more blood, etc., goes to the area, help that recovery process. Except while you're taking creatine, you basically just saturated it the whole time. And so it's kind of a chronic process.
Yeah.
It's just not to the extent at which, you're not getting a bicep pump from taking creatine. It's only small scale. And so you're probably getting a small scale return. But that's the second mechanism that you'll kind of get from that. So if you're in like a weight cutting sport or you're mindful of whatever your weight is, then creatine does have a typical water retention.
Yeah.
That will depend on how much creatine you have in your system prior to taking it as a supplement. So we can get it naturally from food. And it can typically anywhere between kind of like 1 to 3 kilos you can always hold from creatine. Again, depending on how much you had in the body in the first place.
Yeah.
So if that's an issue, then probably don't take creatine.
Yeah.
But if it's not, and you don't necessarily mind, or the goal is to obviously build muscle, then that kind of osmosis effect of drawing water into the muscle cell can hydrate it.
Yeah.
And that kind of hydration actually has been shown anyway that it can lead to muscle growth.
Yeah, because that's actually my next question. So does it increase fat-free mass? So you sort of talked about it with we're adding in water, but then is that helping it recover to therefore build fat-free mass or?
Well, so by definition, fat-free mass is water.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at it in
oh, there you go.
and in most of the research papers, they'll kind of say lean mass or fat-free mass, and that encompasses literally everything that's not fat.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does increase lean mass or fat-free mass because it draws water in. But it, over the long period of time or over an extended period of time, it could increase muscle mass or contractile protein. And so that's the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.
Yeah.
So it's increasing lean mass through hydration. But over a long period of time, obviously, if you're able to do more work, plus the additive effect of that kind of chronic inflammatory response that's in the muscle, because that's where creatine is stored there in the brain, that kind of chronic inflammatory process then helps the recovery, which can then increase contractile protein. Because if you're doing work and you're breaking down muscle, then typically that results in inflammation. The body then creates a bigger muscle so that it doesn't go through that trauma again, because it doesn't want to get broken down. Yeah. And so again, like when you're supplementing with creatine, you're kind of doing that over a chronic or a long period of time. It's just not as quick as like something if you're going to take anabolics, right? Like people often think if you're going to take creatine, you'll get the same result as taking a steroid. Like, it's not going to work anything like that. Yeah. It's just such a small scale. So even in comparison, when you think about the whole pump effect, like the pump or resistance training to get the pump has been shown to increase muscle mass. But creatine is probably like 1/100th of that pump. Yeah. So it's happening on such a small scale. But over a long period of time, if you're chronically taking it, it could definitely add up. And obviously the increased work capacity can lead to you being able to lift more for longer or for more sets. Yeah.
Which will result in more muscle.
Correct.
Building.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. Yep. So what would happen if you were to maybe remove it from your supplements or something like that? Would you end up losing that 1 to 2 kgs sort of thing, or like is because that will be just the water retention that you'll be losing, or like because I think we've seen a few a long time ago. I don't think nowadays, because of how much research is done on it now, like everyone was worried, do I need to keep taking it like to hold that mini pump, So
it will depend on what your habitual intake of creatine is prior. But typically, yes. So if you stop taking creatine, you'll lose that 1 to 2 kilos of water because now you haven't saturated the system. And so you'll lose that kind of osmosis effect that creatine has. And so as it won't be instant, like you'll burn through it over the course of probably a week or so.
Yeah.
And you'll go back to whatever your baseline was beforehand. So it will definitely drop down. And that drop down will pull water out. And so then you'll lose some of that kind of water from within the muscle cell.
Yeah.
Whether it's noticeable or not, I don't know. Like I'd say
I heard like strength though, like the strength's the main part of taking creatine, like you get a lot of strength gains out of it, and I think what would happen if you were to remove it? Do you reckon your strength would diminish, or that sort of actually has been gained by the muscle being built, sort of thing?
Pretty much, it shouldn't. So when you're taking the creatine, so again, like creatine itself won't work even from a strength perspective acutely. So it's not like caffeine. You take the caffeine, you get jacked up, and then you go and lift something. Creatine kind of works in, like I said, it gives your body the ability to do more of that high intensity work. So just by taking the creatine, even if you had if you saturated your creatine stores and you go in and try to do a 1 rep max, it probably won't increase. Well, most of the studies, they do a 1 rep max, they supplement with creatine and train for 8 to 12 weeks and then retest.
Yep.
And so then their 1 rep max has gone up. And that's purely because they had the ability to train more.
Yeah.
But strength itself is neurological. And so what that means is basically the brain is telling the muscle to use more muscle fibers to lift the weight that's on the floor.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so that connection's already been made. Once you've built the strength, that connection's been made. Obviously, you need to continue to do the resistance training to keep that connection going. But that connection and that strength has actually already been built at that point. So removing the creatine there, it'll be unlikely that you'd actually drop strength. I've never personally noticed it.
Yeah, because that's what I think I've sort of seen and heard was just, you'll lose that that mini pump, as we sort of say before, but you should be able to hold on to onto the strength that you've gained through taking creatine over a long period of time.
Correct. And I think it's, again, this is also dependent upon what your habitual intake of creatine is. And so creatine's just naturally found in red meat. Obviously, it's stored in our muscle, so it's stored in other animals' muscle as well. And so the more red meat that you have, typically the higher baseline creatine saturation or stores that you'll likely have. So think of it like a water bottle. Person who eats a decent amount of red meat probably has a fuller water bottle than, let's say, a vegetarian or a vegan.
Yeah.
They have a pretty empty water bottle because they don't consume the source directly.
Yeah.
Okay. So the person of whether or not they'll gain the weight associated with that and the potential benefit that they'll get from taking supplemental creatine will depend on how full that water bottle is to begin with.
Yeah.
So if you consume a lot of red meat, you're probably only looking at very, very marginal increments in either gain and or gains.
Yeah.
Versus if you're a vegetarian, you'll probably actually see quite significant changes.
Yeah.
Or if you're still omnivorous, but you only had red meat maybe once or twice a week, same thing. You'll probably see a decent improvement because your baseline stores are a lot lower than someone who consumes creatine through dietary sources.
Yeah.
On a more habitual level.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting because I saw a guy and he's quite a famous YouTuber and he got his wife to take creatine. And she got ridiculously strong, heaps of results. And then it's interesting you saying that because it's because I've followed this guy for a while and I know pretty much he eats protein and she eats only she should hardly have half a serve of a normal protein. She's majority vegetarian.
Yep.
So that'll probably explain why she actually got insanely stronger, got a lot of results out of that.
Yeah.
So he needs to listen to this podcast, I reckon, and because he was at the end of it going why the hell? I think he was saying maybe don't take these results for something because because of the way that she trains. She just trains hard, trained hard with him, sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's pretty replicable. So if you take any kind of vegetarian or vegan that doesn't supplement with creatine and or any kind of omnivore or person who eats everything.
Yep.
That doesn't consume a lot of red meat, you'll probably see a lot more benefit from the creatine, and it's pretty replicable. So across the board, as long as they aren't having a lot of creatine in their food or from dietary sources, they'll see pretty decent benefits from taking it. Versus the person who does consume a lot, they'll see very marginal.
Yeah, it's annoying because there's a podcast that just came, not podcast, Netflix series that came out. Did you see that one? That was about twins.
And
they were going a vegetarian or a vegan, going meat, like majority meat-based diet versus a vegan diet, and like they skewed the data. They literally was hiding all of the stuff. If you should watch it, you should watch it because it'll frustrate you, bro. Because
most of them do. That's why I just stay off it. Like,
I would say you should be able to do a little a review of this and be like, give me these markers, because I know just from our conversations, you know, what I sort of want to see on someone's like data list that they got, and then they were just, so then they didn't even have like the fat-free muscle mass loss and like gains and stuff like that.
I think from what I've heard, it's the same people who
they own Beyond Meat.
Oh, that's one.
Yeah, Beyond. Yeah, so it's either Game Changers or it's heavily funded by the vegan industry. Yeah. But
I think all of those documentaries, like it's a good like little warning sign for most documentaries. Like
they're narrative based, like they're pushing a narrative.
They're there. It's also a business, right? Like they're there to get the views, and like Netflix wouldn't have bought it or given it the rights if it wasn't going to get views. And so same as social media, like the best way to get views is to be inflammatory and to push that kind of message, because it's like it sparks people, and then other people watch it, and just like literally even from us talking about it, like that sparks more people watching it. And that's what sells. But for most part, like if you're looking at like a lot of food-based documentaries, try and see if there is an underlying, and it is an agenda, but that's not necessarily to say that agendas are good or bad. It's just, again, like I think we talked about in terms of bias, like it's the bias in which that lens is being shown.
For sure.
And so it's been able to kind of like look at that and understand that bias and then be objective. I think the hard part with nutrition is that it's like we assume that they're the experts. And so they're telling us things that we shouldn't know.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think the message just gets kind of murky.
Yeah. Well, we talk about it quite a lot, you know, like if there's too much information out there, and then now it's almost like a vetting process that you got to go through and go, all right, like, who's this guy? How do I take, you know, his word for his word, or, you know, look, like I tend to say is like follow the money or follow the trail. If they've got a discount code, or they've got a, you know, like, do you know what I mean? They've kind of, they have incentive, you know, like and I would say for the Netflix programs as well, like that's what I did personally. Like and what I do when I say, I go, hold on a moment here. Like they're pushing this. All right, let's go and find out who's actually funded this. And like, and you can even do that for the medical studies. I would say, like, you know, a lot of them, it's, you go, all right, who's funded this? And you can usually follow the paper trail, and then you'll go, okay, does that person have an invested interest in them saying, oh, this is this way, and you need to go and buy this because this is this way? It's like, well, and then you see, oh, they own that company. You know, like it's.
When I mean, like, I get it, and again, like a lot of the research stuff, I get a lot of it because they have to get funding somewhere. And so that funding likely won't come from government departments for the most part. And so
or they are just from government departments.
Or they are just from government departments. But a lot of the, like, especially in either supplements or the diet space, typically, in the diet space, some of them they are, because government health obviously wants to overlook where they put their money. But, you know, individual things that they need the companies in order to sponsor, or the companies need the study done in order to get backing. Because like if they've produced the supplement but it's got no study behind it, then they're like, well, I've got no credibility behind so I need to fund that because otherwise no one's going to study my product. So they need to fund it. It's just whether or not, one, you would hope to assume that, again, there's at least scientific rigor amongst all those papers.
But that's where peer review comes into the thing, where that's getting cut off because they get the funding, yes, and then when it's up for peer review, it's just, oh, you know, take my word for it as it is.
Or it's a single study. So that single study really means sweet fuck all, because it should be reviewed in terms of being able to be replicated by other people, and so that's why you need multiple of those studies. But even then, it's, you know, to be able to interpret, so everyone will interpret the results differently. And so one person could look at those results, and it might still be the person who's studying it might look at that results and come up with a completely different conclusion than someone else who's looking at that same set of results and be like, that makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
Like this person 1 + 1 = 2, but this one is 2 + 2 = 5. And it doesn't quite work out. And so it's even being able to look at that study and be like, okay, so who are they doing it in? What are they testing? Because of what they're testing, what are they not testing? And have they tried to come to a conclusion based on something that they're not even testing in the first place?
Yeah, correct.
Most people, they try to. And that's why it becomes inflammatory.
Yeah. Well, like, it might be actually a good little spin off that, you know, how testing different types of products and stuff like that. What are the different types of creatines? And, you know, is one better than the other? We can probably go about how, you know, you do studies and stuff like, why are there more than just one creatine? Because like from my knowledge, it's just monohydrate.
So that again, like that's the one that's had the most backing to date. So that one is if you're looking for creatine research, for the most part, it's all been done in creatine monohydrate. Now, I mean, that could be its own agenda, purely because there's actually only one company in the world that produces it.
Oh, yeah.
So it all comes, I'm pretty sure it's from Russia.
Yeah.
All comes from Russia. And so every brand, if you see Creapure, which pretty much, I think every single creatine monohydrate is, if it's a monohydrate, it's a Creapure, which is a brand.
Is that them owning the patent or something like that? Or
Yeah.
Interesting.
So
well,
they came up with it.
Yep.
They made, and again, like we're looking at agendas.
Don't send me down a rabbit hole, brother. I fucking run at those things.
But so they wanted those studies done to show that there was efficacy in their product, right?
Yeah.
And so now it's kind of taken its own little like momentum storm of what pretty much every single research, because all the research that had been done prior had been done in monohydrate, all the research now gets done in monohydrate because it's just adding to the
interesting
the efficacy of that protocol.
I just thought a lot of them split them up just so they could just try and make more money out of all the other sort of things.
Brands will.
But I think but that's what I mean. The other, there's like a few, I don't even know them now, like because they sort of came to market and then like a lot of them, because it's just glorified monohydrate pretty much, right?
So I think there's hydrochloride or HCl, so creatine HCl. There's crealkanine, which I don't think has the water retention. I think they all do very similar things, maybe plus or minus the water retention. So the HCl, typically you don't need as much of it. So if you get a little bit of like gut distress, you could take the HCl, which you don't need as much of it.
Oh, yeah.
But again, that one hasn't been studied
as much
as monohydrate,
and is 4 times the price or something like that. So
correct.
Yeah.
Yep. That one I would see more in line with the protein. So, you know, we talked about whey concentrate versus a whey isolate, more filtration, similar.
Yeah,
so it's just kind of like
processing that's going through it, the more
machinery, manpower, etc. So it's just driving the price up. And then the alkaline one, I'm alkalized. So it's kind of, that one doesn't retain the fluid.
Yep.
But for the most part, like for me, if I'm looking at it from a muscle gain perspective, I kind of want the fluid.
Yeah.
If you only want it purely from an energetic perspective, and you do have issues with gaining weight, so you're in a weight-based sport, potentially that one would be better. Again, it just hasn't been studied enough to say that, yes, it's just as good as the original creatine monohydrate. And that's purely because monohydrate has just been around for so much longer. And one bro's got the patent of it, and so he's just been pumping his own research, really.
Oh, that's actually quite interesting. Yeah. Well, like there is a lot of research on it, which is, I think, is quite the good thing about it, right? Like,
correct.
So that's what I mean. You can get that meta-analysis, and then like we talked about peer review and research like that. You know, like it's going through due diligence, you know.
Correct. And that's what I mean. It's not necessarily
like, even though he owns that, like it's actually, well, we've got a whole bunch of other people that are coming in and you know, putting their stamp on it and going, okay,
it works here, it works here, it's good for this, etc., or it's not good here, it's not good there. And again, like, you 100%, there's an agenda behind that. Like, the dude wanted to get his product on the market.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
And every single monohydrate is Career Pure.
Yeah.
Totally.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. But
it's by going through like a proper scientific process, you're able to kind of wean out the agenda based.
Well, it's a good product.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
It's actually passed the tests.
That's it. It's an effective, safe product that works for what it's meant to work for.
We're almost done here. I reckon it's been really good actually. Doses actually, we probably should have a little touch on that there. I've heard of a loading phase. Those sort of things. If you're going to load up, or what's your opinion on those? There, I've heard mixed things about it. Like it doesn't even matter for a loading phase. You just start introducing it to you. You don't need to be going over the board from the start. Or
I think the first thing to consider is how long you're going to be taking it for. So again, a lot of the times, because
what would you recommend?
Doesn't matter.
Yeah,
it doesn't really matter. So, at the point, if you know you're going to take it for, let's say, a month, or you are going into a training block, or you're coming up to a competition, and you wanted to make sure that you had available energy there, and you weren't taking creatine before, then you probably want to get your system saturated as quickly as you can. So if you have a time window, or let's just say it's one of those supplements that you can afford now, but you don't really want to be spending $50 on it or $40 on it every month kind of thing. And so, I'll take it this time, or maybe I'll only take it while I'm really focusing on gaining muscle mass.
Yep.
Outside of that, I don't really worry about it. So let's say there is a small time domain that you kind of have to act and use it. You want to try and saturate the muscle as quickly as possible. So the goal there would be, it would be better to load in that instance, because you're getting that saturation. It's all about filling that water bottle up. So it's whether or not you just have a little trickle of water going in there, or whether or not turn the tap on the full bore.
Yeah.
Loading is literally just turning the tap on the full bore.
Yeah.
So it's just filling it up as quickly as possible. And then from there, normally takes about a week. So it's typically 20 grams per day, and you can split the dose. So like 10 grams or 4 or 5 grams kind of thing.
For the loading
phase.
Yeah.
So it's 20 grams per day for a week, and that'll load your system. And then from there, you can go to a maintenance dose of 5 grams per day. And that's essentially saturate the muscle as quickly as possible. From there, you'll get the benefit.
And if you're going for a longer, if you're just one of the bros, and
if you're one of the bros and you're just taking it and you just enjoy lifting, and that's just a part of it, and you want to continue to take it. So if you're going to take it for an extended period of time, there's probably no point in loading it, because now we're talking about, okay, well, you're going to saturate the muscle at 5 grams per day anyway. It will just take a couple of weeks rather than 1 week.
Yeah.
So you're looking at the difference between, now you're going to get the gain after 1 week versus you'll start getting the gain after 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so it's like really in the spectrum of things, in the course of 6 months or a year, what's that extra week? Probably nothing.
Well, you're losing about 8 weeks of creatine by loading it anyway, right?
Yeah, well, and you have to buy it sooner as well.
So there's that there's sort of like kind of like a myth that you don't really like, unless you're, like you're saying, for that little specific window.
Yep. So, I mean, for me, actually, if I'm to think about me, I don't consume a lot of red meat personally. I'd consume it mostly, my protein from fish and chicken, to be fair. So my red meat consumption is relatively low. And I don't take creatine year round, yet I do always kind of come on and off it.
Yeah.
So for me, actually, loading it is typically better.
Yep.
And that's purely because while I'm taking it, like I'll normally have 1 to 2 batches of it.
Yep.
So I'll just try and get the most out of it for the time that I'm taking it.
Yep.
And then there'll be times where I won't even, I'll completely forget, and then I just won't take it.
Yep.
And so for me, if I'm kind of going back into the phase of it, I'll load it, get it up, or saturate my stores as quickly as I can.
Yep.
And then basically 20 grams per day and then 5 grams per day. But yeah, if you're just going to continuously take it, then 5 grams per day is, you'll get there eventually.
Yeah, and for those there, like you can continuously take this product as well without it having any side effects or damages. Yeah,
correct. And again, I think a lot of that came from probably the steroid body, and so that was kind of related that to what was it? Mum thinks I'm taking steroids, and pulls out the creatine, exactly.
Creatine tub,
and so you got to run your cycle of creatine. Two, it kind of got caught with studies mostly at 8 to 12 weeks. So if you do a training study, you can't just do a training study forever. So they'll do a training study or a strength study, and they'll do a bout of 8 to 12 weeks, because normally that's how long a training study goes for.
Yeah.
And so then obviously they're supplementing for creatine for 8 to 12 weeks. And so then when people do a creatine cycle, they're like, oh, well, the study says do the creatine for 8 to 12 weeks and you'll get X gain. Well, then they'll do the same thing.
Yeah, and they think they're just cycling.
Correct.
Yeah. When realistically, you better to just
you can just keep taking it.
Yeah, you can keep taking it.
Yep.
Awesome. I think that was really good.
Great.
Yeah.
I mean, if anyone has kind of like questions on creatine, like I said, quite a bit of it can get a little bit lost in the nuance of the scientific kind of side of things, but you're more than welcome to flick messages through and we can kind of get back to them.
Yeah, I reckon that would be great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, guys.